wise man once said, "A picture paints 1,000 words." Then a clever man said, "In what language?" Makes us think. So I'd like to take you through a little bit of an exercise. Can anybody identify that? Yes? No? A glass of wine. It's the thing that keeps us going the whole day. It's a coffee machine. Right, let's do another one. Are you certain this is a cat? It's a cat. Just look at those eyes. I mean, we always talk about puppy eyes, but can you just imagine sort of staring at that in the morning when you're standing there with the food? It's like, "Feed me, Seymour." It's like, no. Anyway. So, as analysts, we're all analysts here, or most of us are analysts here, we need to ask the question, what is it that we really do? Now, I think that it is quite an important thing to ask, because sometimes people just don't get what it is that we do. We run around and we do stuff. Elicit and understand and communication of requirements, that's pretty much what we do. What does that mean? Pretty much it means that somewhere along the line, we go and speak to people. Hopefully, we understand what they say. We need to understand what they say, where it fits into some sort of a bigger picture, in terms of identifying what it is, what they actually want. Just want to look at something here. Once we have understood exactly what it is, we need to start communicating this picture back to them. Through this process, we need to understand, elicit, and expose the requirements of any kind of system that we need to build. This is very much like playing, this is a very bad picture, please excuse me. Like Warcraft, this is a picture of a map of Skyrim. I'm not a big gamer, but the point that I'm trying to show you here is that you start off with, at some point in the on a map, and as you walk through this area, this world, you start to understand new things. You know, you get tasks, you get goals and objectives, and you know, eventually this thing gets it gets a lot clearer for you. So, thinking about what it is, what we do, what is the thing that, why are we here? What is the main goal of our existence as analysts? Anybody? Word? One word? Couple of sentences? What's it? Charades? We're here for interpret of requirements. That is what we're here for. That is what we need to do. And that should be our main be-all and end-all goal of trying to survive in the corporate landscape. So, for dummies, I came up with a bit of a definition in terms of explaining to somebody exactly what it is that we as analysts do. First, we find some people to talk to. Why? If we don't speak to people, it's very difficult to listen to people. If you can't listen to people, you don't get any requirements. We write that down. Why do we do that? So that we don't forget what we spoke about in the first place. We find some other people. A very important step. Why is this? Because we need to validate what we wrote down with the first people. Certainly, if I go and ask Bob about a requirement and he gives me answer A, and I go and ask his wife, okay, that may be a bad example. If I go ask his colleague about the same requirement, we should be getting exactly or a very similar answer. Once we've validated what we've done, what we've sort of elicited, we need to make it pretty, and then at some point in time, we need to share what we've learned. So sharing comes in many forms, documentation and those kind of things. I'm not going to go into that aspect of the process at the moment because it's not entirely relevant to what I want to achieve. So where do we actually start in this process? Let's say I walk into a new client and I have absolutely no idea what's going on here. I don't know what the internal processes are. I don't know who the stakeholders are. I don't know where the bathrooms are, lo and behold. So this is actually a bit of a problem, because if I don't know who to talk to, once again, especially in terms of our main goal of getting requirements, we won't be able to do what we're supposed to be doing. We won't be able to fulfill our function. If we have figured out the first point, who to talk to, what to talk about becomes the next point of the agenda in terms of our little process. So what to talk about is very relevant, and most of what I'm trying to achieve today is going to focus around that aspect. A little bit more about that in a couple of minutes. We also need to identify or try and extract true requirements. You know, requirement is it's a funny thing, because sometimes what people tell you is not what they want. Sometimes what they want is not what they need. And we need to understand all of that in order to build some sort of a system that brings value to the different stakeholders. So, are the requirements valid? Have we actually gone back and validated with other people? Now, in order to look at this process from a little bit of a higher level, we need to have some sort of a compass. How do we get from point A to point B? Now, a lot of analysts, when they start out, I think feel a little bit lost in terms of just how do they get to this thing, because everybody says, where's the spec, where's the story, where's something, show me something, do something. And not everybody, or not a lot of people, actually take a step back and say, how do I actually do this? So let's look at a process that encompasses what we need to do. So what I'd like to do here is I'd like to take you through a couple of steps, the way that I understand the elicitation process. And then later on, we're going to apply that process looking at some pictures. So the first thing that we do, or the first thing that happens in such an exercise, is we get some work. Somebody comes to us and says, Bob has a requirement, go speak to Bob, or, we need to build some sort of a system. Go forth, conquer, and find the requirements. Right, that is all good and well, but we need to understand what it is that we're trying to achieve. It's very difficult sometimes to say, I am done, when I haven't even decided or understood what I had to do in the first place. How long is a piece of string? How good is good enough? I need to understand exactly what it is what we need to do. We need to identify our stakeholders. Now, I'm going to spend a little bit more time in terms of who our stakeholders are later. But through our project team, our colleagues, secretaries, we can identify who the people are that we need to speak to. And I need to emphasize that this is not always one person, because there's always somebody else that has the same requirement or a similar requirement for a different reason. And this is something that we very often forget. Sometimes our stakeholders, we can't get to them. And this is where the politics part comes in. Either I'm not allowed to speak to Bob because, you know what, the project manager says, no, I have to go and unblock him first. Because, it's just how the process works. This may be a person that is very busy. It may be a person that has other things to do. But we often actually get into that situation where we can't speak to a person because of whatever reason. So, if they're blocked, what do? Simple. You find somebody else. I mean, there's nothing else you can do. If you can't speak to somebody, then you need to actually get around that blockage and actually go and speak to somebody who will speak to you. So, eventually, we're getting to a point where we've unblocked our stakeholders, we can start engaging them, start having the discussions. Then we need to, through our discussions, actually understand the requirement. This is also where our pictures comes in, as I'll show you a little bit later. How does our requirements fit into the big picture? Why are we doing this? There's a couple of questions that we often need to ask and that we sometimes forget to ask in terms of just understanding whether a requirement is valid and what the actual requirement is. But we'll get into that. We need to validate this, speak to different people, ask the same questions in a different way. If it's not valid, let's go back and understand the scope of our work. Why do we need to do that? Because if Bob says, my requirement is A, but everybody else says the requirement is B, certainly there's been some sort of a miscommunication. And we can't carry on. If we've eventually gone through and understood all of our requirements, we need to make it pretty, we need to disseminate the information and actually write it up and document it. So, let's take a step back and go look at our stakeholders. Who's our stakeholders? Board of directors. Now, why would these people be a stakeholder? I mean, I go to my business owner. I get all my requirements from them. Who's actually running the business? Who needs to look at the strategic direction that this business is going to take and what tools is going to help them to actually fulfill those strategic objectives? Our board of directors looks at the bigger picture. They're going to actually be the people who wants the business to succeed. A system is just a tool. Finance, bean counters. Who pays for this? Often question comes up, build versus buy, lease. Somebody needs to make the question or make the decision in terms of, are we paying for this? How are we paying for this? Are we getting some sort of a return on investment? Very important, depending on what your project is. Business owners. Business owners have a specific goal to achieve in their area of business. And it's quite often that they are the driving forces behind implementation of different systems in order to fulfill that goal. So if they have a specific need, they might need to either automate a system, they might need to actually have some sort of a control imposed in terms of whatever it is that they need to do. Systems owners. The system that the business owner wants needs to have a daddy. I know it sounds a little bit of a excuse me. Sounds a little bit stupid, but somebody needs to actually look after this baby and nurse it and actually make it grow up so that it can do what it needs to do. Architects. who's the person who actually goes and decides how the system will be built? Certainly we need somebody that oversees that and keeps us sort of pointed in the right direction in terms of what the enterprise is doing, where the enterprise is going. Cost comes into effect there as well. Our actual dev team, does our development team actually have the skills to do whatever it is that they need to do? But more importantly, do we as analysts understand the capabilities of the system that they can build? If I don't know as an analyst what the capabilities of HTML5 is, how can I go and sell a requirement or sell a solution to a business owner or any other stakeholder if I don't know what the capability is? I mean, might as well do it in Notepad or whatever, in Excel. I mean, I've done awesome stuff in Excel. Not the right stuff, but I've done stuff. Our support team, also quite often a group of people that sometimes gets treated as an afterthought. If you think about any kind of system, let's take e-filing for instance. I go in, I do my return and so on, and I get stuck. I have some sort of a problem. I need to pick up the phone and I need to speak to somebody to say, I've got a bit of a problem here and help me out with this. I don't understand what code 4005 means. If we don't enable and equip our support team with the necessary knowledge and tools in order to support the system, they won't be able to do it. It seems obvious. Common sense. If everybody had common sense, the world would be a better place. Also, if it was common. Anyway. Last but certainly not least, our end users. How many of us actually take the time to go and sit with that call center agent who needs to be using the system and actually asking him, you know what, this is what this thing is going to look like and this is what it does. Is this intuitive for you? Can you actually use it? What is the amount of training that you need to actually get in order to be proficient in terms of what it is that we want you to achieve? So, these stakeholders are like a bunch of cats. Why do we say that? Because getting hold of them, engaging them, is sometimes a bit of a problem. Why do I say that? There's certain factors that I've had a look at that plays a part. Seniority. Now, I come from an age where, when I grew up, everything was, how can I put this, not democratic. When I was in boarding school, when I was in the army, if somebody said something, you stood at attention, you did what you had to do without any question, you just did it. That was just how I grew up. I never learned the ability to walk up to my boss, slap him on the back and say, hey, let's go have a cup of coffee. Now, today, that culture has changed. I may still be archaic, but the rest of us aren't. What I'm trying to say is that you have different people at different levels who you might need to approach in a different manner. Location. If we're not co-located in the same office, let's say we located in India versus South Africa, that's a factor that we need to take into consideration. How are we going to engage these people if we can't sit across the table with them and actually speak to them? I mean, yes, there's Skype for Business and all sorts of tools that we can use, but it makes the communication process so much more difficult. Calendars. Calendars is sometimes one of the big stumbling blocks in getting requirements. I mean, you have something that you need to have a 5-minute discussion in order to type up a user story that's going to take you maybe 10 minutes, and you can only get a slot in the guy's diary in a week's time. That means the elapsed time for your project is going to be a week. What are you going to do as an analyst for the time in between? Sit and twiddle your thumb. You're not going to get paid for that. Last but not least, language. When I was working at Gensec Property Services many years ago, I worked with a guy from a company called Red Brigade in India. Basava was a very clever guy. But I could not understand how to communicate this guy, because at that point in time I had to explain to him that he had to take the values from one field, add it to the values to another field or from another field, and then populate the result in the third field. And he kept on saying to me, but he understands. And I eventually, I just couldn't grasp the fact that this means yes. We had a very stupid communication gap because I didn't understand his culture. I didn't understand how he communicated. It was a failure on my part, and I only realized that later in life, unfortunately. So, when we start and engage our stakeholders, I like to think of it, this process of engaging, as the 3 C's. First, let's converse. Let's have a talk. Go grab a cup of coffee. Let the person vent why he wants this specific requirement. Yes, I want this system, and it must change tires, and it must do this, and what is the blue sky picture? What is it that you want? Eventually, if you've understood that, or while you're trying to understand that, you need to go and create. Draw a model, draw a picture of what it is that you think this person needs. Eventually, corroborate. Replay this to him. Go and say, okay, fine, Bob, this is how I understand your requirement. Is this what you meant? If he says yes, take that same picture and go speak to somebody else. Hopefully you'll get the same answer. Here I've taken, you might not be able to see it, just a simple documentation diagram with some systems owners and some documents. What I'm trying to say, or to show you here, is the fact that for a specific stakeholder, you may have a various amount of documentations that's relevant to him from a specific perspective. The same with a document. The same document is going to be consumed by different people for different reasons. So, what do we want to show on these documents, on these pictures, on these models? Is there a standard modeling notation? Is there a standard way of speaking? We said, well, yeah, use it, of course yes. A picture paints 1,000 words. But can we speak the language? So important. It's all about perspective. We have a guy here that's walking towards a tree. What does he see? He sees a tree. If I had to walk from the front and I was looking at the same tree, what would I see? The same tree. Would I see the same branches? No. Would I see the kite that's stuck in on the other side? Maybe yes. It all depends on your perspective and where you look at the problem from. So, to recap, what I'd like to do now, I'm going to go through some pictures, some models, and very briefly try to highlight what the value for different stakeholders would be. So the idea here was we create a system. For want of a better example, it's a streaming system. It's a play on the old video store example that we all used or all got in our training. And the idea here is that similar to other streaming services out there, you register, you can stream content, and you pay. So, in terms of context diagrams, let's describe the system. What is the relevance to the different stakeholders? We've got a business owner, we've got a systems owner. If the business owner looks at this picture, he would see, okay, fine, you know what, we've got customers, suppliers, and management that needs to integrate or interface into this system. How are they actually going to do that? Is there somebody missing? Our systems owner might look at the actual data flows that goes in and out and think, how are we going to achieve this in terms of the data that we need to populate the system? Process flows. Taking each or breaking the system down into smaller chunks to identify all the process pieces that builds up all the pieces of functionality. If my systems architect looks at all these different processes, what is he going to see? What is he going to look at? Is he going to look at how are we actually going to achieve a logon? Are we going to integrate into LDAP? Are we going to build our own thing? How are we actually going to maintain usernames, passwords, those kind of things? Our development team, they might think, yes, you know what, we've done all of this before, so we can just maybe refactor some code and make it fit for purpose. Would that be the right thing to do at that point in time? We don't know. We can't say. However, if you have the picture, you can actually go back and say, you know what, let us understand this in a better way and open up that discussion. Feature roadmaps. So somewhere along the line, project management, business owners, business owners, board of directors, people want to know how a system is going to get built. So you might have different pieces that will be available at different times that might lead to a minimum viable product. How does this help our support team? Certainly they would want to know what is available in the system at that point in time. Should a customer ask them, I can't do function X, Y, or Z, or what have you. I can file my return, but I can't request a calculation. They can actually go back and say, but you know what, we've got that plan for a next release, and this might be coming in a couple of months' time. Architecture diagrams. Once again, whoever looks at the picture is going to look at it from a different point of view. So our support team might think, you know what, we've got 6 web apps there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 web apps there. What's the points of failure that we can have? How is this thing going to scale? Somebody else, for instance, our development team, I think, you know what, we've got 2 DBs and what have you, but what is the actual database that we're going to use? Is it going to be performant to fulfill our requirements? Use case diagrams. Highlighting the actors, what each actor might actually want to do in this specific system. How would this make a difference to the lives of an architect versus the development team? Certainly, our architect might want to think, you know what, once again, let's look at the use cases that we have there. Does it make sense for a manager and a customer to have the same login? Shouldn't there be some sort of difference? Are we implementing role-based access? How are we going to do this? Activity flows. Taking a process and breaking it down into smaller chunks and smaller pieces. If you take this picture and you sort of give it to a developer, you might think, yes, I can do that. That's easy. I have to do these couple of things and it's done. There's an error screen that I need. What's the styling? How must this thing behave? If we speak to our architect, he might think, guys, okay, what are the systems that we need to integrate with in order to make this functionally feasible? last but not least, the data model. If you take a data model, very quickly draw it out, and you give it to a database DB admin, what's the first thing that he's going to think about? Having said that, I'm not a DBA, but surely they would start thinking about, the amount of tables, the amount of records that you're going to have in there. Do we need to have indexes? What's the cost of having this data? Is this going to be housed internally, or is this going to be a cloud-based solution? Different questions or different diagrams and pictures will lead to different questions, that we need to answer. Different pictures means different things to different people, and that's what I'm trying to say. Once we start unlocking our stakeholders and we start engaging with them, we can actually get to a point where hopefully we'll actually understand what it is that we need to do. Hopefully we'll be able to document and communicate what our requirements are supposed to be. So who's at fault here? The guy who built the bicycle with the square wheels, or the guy who didn't say that he wanted round wheels? Something to think about. Now, we need to engage our stakeholders, and I spoke about it earlier. How do we do that? We ask them questions. A typical play on the 5 bums on a bench. Why, when, where, who, what, and the bench is how. So let's keep this as a guideline in order to engage, in order to elicit those requirements, in order to make the conversations. To recap, let's converse, let's speak, let us have the discussions that will unlock our requirements. Let's create. If you don't know a notation of a BPMN model, learn it, Google it. There's these standard dialects that we actually need to learn. Eventually, corroborate. It's very important. And I think this is one of the steps that we so often miss. Taking the same requirement and actually just validating it with a different stakeholder. And thank you very much for attending the talk.